On September 26, 2025, in the city of Geneva, a meeting took place that was hidden from the public, but destined to change the story of Africa and the West. The room was quiet, the doors closed, the list of attendees restricted to only a handful of trusted aides. At one end sat Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, carrying with him the authority of an alliance that had long projected power across the globe. At the other sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, a man who had risen in the chaos of the Sahel and who carried on his shoulders the defiance of a continent weary of foreign domination. What unfolded was more than negotiation. It was history pressing down on the present, the clash of two worldviews, one demanding obedience and the other refusing to bow. NATO came with a carefully crafted offer. On the surface, it was everything a struggling nation might want: security against terror, modern bases, protection of resources, economic aid. Rutte's words were polished, his tone diplomatic, his documents prepared in the style of Western promises that had been rehearsed for decades. He began with fear, reciting the numbers that painted the Sahel as a region drowning in blood. More than 10,000 civilians killed in attacks between 2015 and 2023. Villages turned into graves, governments weakened, hope drained from ordinary lives. He told Traoré that NATO had the experience, the intelligence networks, the advanced technology, the drones, the surveillance satellites, the capacity to protect civilians in a way no regional force could. Then came the military pitch. He invoked the American-built base at Agadez in Niger, a $110 million project that served as a fortress of drones and surveillance. He said Burkina Faso could have the same, a hub of control that would project power across the borders, watching every movement, striking enemies before they struck first. He presented this as partnership, as security, as progress. From there, he moved to resources, the lifeblood of global power. He pointed to the uranium mines of Niger, once responsible for a quarter of France's nuclear energy supply. NATO, he said, would safeguard such assets not only for the stability of the region, but for the prosperity of its people. In his words, this protection would benefit all of Africa. Yet in truth, everyone in the room knew uranium meant leverage, not liberation. Finally, he brought in the economy, the promise of money. He reminded Traoré of Ghana's $3 billion bailout in 2023. Orchestrated through the IMF, Burkina Faso, he hinted, could be offered the same if it aligned with NATO's designs. With IMF money came loans, with loans came dependency, and with dependency came control. On paper, the package looked irresistible, but nothing in that room was what it seemed, because NATO was not the real author. Donald Trump was. He was the hidden hand behind the offer, using NATO as a mask, pushing to reinsert American power into the Sahel before Russia and China filled the gap. For a long moment, Ibrahim Traoré remained silent. He let the weight of Rutte's words hang in the air, let the silence speak louder than the promises. Then with calmness that cut sharper than anger, he responded. He did not address the numbers first. He addressed history. He recalled Operation Flintlock, the yearly US-led exercise that had been presented since 2005 as training local forces. Every year it promised empowerment. Every year it left behind dependency and resentment. He recalled the airport in Niger, upgraded into a base for American MQ-9 Reaper drones. It was hailed as progress, but to the people of Niger, it was surveillance, it was occupation, it was foreign eyes watching their skies. He recalled the uranium mines exploited since the 1970s by the French company Areva, now called Orano. Decades of extraction had filled French banks, but the people of Niger lived in poverty, their land scarred, their dignity ignored. He recalled the French presence in Mali, 9 years of soldiers and bases between 2013 and 2022, 9 years of speeches about security, 9 years in which terrorist attacks tripled. The evidence, he said, was overwhelming. Foreign presence had never been the solution, it had always been the problem. And then came the words that changed the room. You promise security, yet every time you arrive, insecurity grows. You promise prosperity, yet every time you stay, our resources are drained. You call it partnership, we call it exploitation. The chamber grew tense. Even Rudder's aides lowered their eyes. This was no longer diplomacy, it was an indictment. Pressed against the wall, Rudder leaned forward. His voice hardened, the mask of courtesy slipping. He warned Traoré that without NATO, the Sahel would collapse into the hands of the Islamic State. He insisted that Burkina Faso could not stand alone, that only NATO had the intelligence, the training, the global networks to protect the region. Without us, he said, you will lose everything. But Traoré did not flinch. He did not even raise his voice. He asked a question instead. If NATO is the shield against terror, then why has terror only grown stronger in every place NATO and France have been present? Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Our people see the truth. Your shield has holes, and worse, your presence feeds the very threat you claim to fight. His calmness was more devastating than anger. His words stripped the offer bare, exposing the contradictions at its core. When news of Traoré's rejection reached Washington, Donald Trump erupted in fury. In the Oval Office, aides described him slamming his fist on the desk, his jaw tight, his voice shaking with rage. This boy will regret it, he muttered. To Trump, it was not only a setback, it was humiliation. It was a precedent that could ripple across the continent. If Burkina Faso could defy him, why not others? But for Traoré, the meaning was different. He had not only rejected NATO's polished package, he had rejected NATO itself, the United States, and Trump personally. He had broken with the old order that had dominated Africa for generations, and with that break came consequences. NATO scrambled to prove it was not weakened. Within weeks, new deals were signed with Ghana and Ivory Coast, granting American forces access to bases and facilities. Officially, they were routine agreements. In reality, they were a direct response to Traoré's defiance. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the president moved in the opposite direction. He signed contracts with Turkey for Bayraktar drones, weapons that had proven effective in Libya, Syria, Ukraine. This was not only a purchase, it was a statement. Burkina Faso would not beg NATO for security. It would build its own. The Sahel alliance, formed with Mali and Niger, rallied stronger. Leaders praised Traoré's stand. Media across the region hailed it as a turning point, a symbolic end to decades of Western dominance. On the streets, the people celebrated. Crowds filled the squares, waving flags, chanting his name. Murals appeared overnight, painted by young artists who saw in him not only a leader, but a symbol of dignity and defiance. And then came the revelation that shook the world. A leak from within NATO exposed the truth. The documents Rudder had presented in Geneva had not been drafted in Brussels at all. They had come directly from Washington. At the bottom of one memo was the unmistakable signature, Donald J. Trump. The narrative collapsed. What had been framed as NATO's offer was revealed as America's maneuver. Across Africa, the leak confirmed what Traoré had already said. NATO was a mask, and behind the mask was a hand that sought to control. In Ouagadougou, the people poured into the streets again, chanting that their president had been right. In Europe, officials were embarrassed, caught in the shadow of an alliance that had been hijacked by one man's ambition. But instead of being isolated, Traoré turned the revelation into a weapon. He spoke to his people, and his words echoed across the continent. We are not against NATO, we are not against the United States, but we refuse to be treated as a square on someone else's chessboard. Not even if the hand moving the pieces belongs to Donald Trump himself. The effect was electric. His statement spread across radios, televisions, and social media. In Dar es Salaam, in Bamako, in Kinshasa, Africans repeated his words. Africa was no longer passive. Africa was awake. In Washington, Trump fumed. In Brussels, officials whispered that the door to the Sahel had closed. But in Ouagadougou, the air was alive with something new. It was not fear, it was pride. When Traoré stood before thousands outside the presidential palace, his voice carried over the crowd. We do not ask permission to be free. We rise and take our freedom with our own hands. The roar that followed was more than celebration. It was the voice of a continent declaring that the age of silence was over. What began as a secret meeting in Geneva had become a moment of reckoning. A young leader from a landlocked nation had faced NATO, had faced Washington, had faced Donald Trump, and had refused to bend. And in that refusal, he shifted the balance of power. He became not only the president of Burkina Faso, he became a symbol for Africa itself.